think we have enough example to really fully understand what point of care manufacturing looks like. Where I imagine it in my head is things like, okay, I take the blood from the patient, I do something with it in a closed automated machine, and then I put it right in the patient, right? That's how I think about it. But I'm sure there's many different modality. In my mind, it's the product quality. Is like, if we're really talking about a short manufacturing process, can you get it done? Can you have a CAR T the way that we know it, that it needs to be, right? The same quality in that short amount of time. Now, and like I said, all the rest, I think if it works, then we can figure the rest out. Like, we'll find ways from a regulatory perspective and testing.
I second your opinion, Tal, and I'll add that I think if you sort of imagine the most extreme version of this, right? It's entirely decentralized manufacturing, and how do you assure that the product that's made in one place is going to be comparable in quality and potency and safety to the product that's made in a different place? And then you multiply that times, I don't know, however many sites you could envision at this sort of, bedside CAR T model, if that's what's in my head, right? I think there's extreme challenges there in terms of assuring safety, potency, and efficacy for that product.
As long as these products still needs to be regulated, we're going to have those challenges.
Yeah. I think that's an interesting point, Tal, that I would always have wondered about. Maybe I'll get a chance to ask you about it right now. It seems like that's sort of like the stem cell transplant model, right? Mm-hmm. Stem cell transplants are completely decentralized. They're point of care. They're made by individual hospitals and administered. And my understanding, although I'm a little naive on this, to be honest, is like they're regulated in a completely different way. There's no BLA that a company has for a stem cell transplant product.
It depends. As they need to be minimally manipulated for not to, but so it just depends. It depends on the process. But yeah, we are, I think that when we think about CAR T cells, we have a lot of BLAs for CAR T cells. We kind of understand well how it works, but I think we're very far from, regulation-wise, like they need to be regulated right now unless the regulation change. And it's complex enough that in my mind, it still needs to be regulated enough. So like you need those testing to release it to make sure, right, that you have sufficient percent transduction. And only after you make 1 million lots, you can really show, no, we always get, there's never any mistakes, right?
Yeah. That's why I think it's a fundamentally different, like I think where a lot of the push comes from in like true point of care, like you're defining, is like, hey, it works for stem cell transplant. Can it work? But it's fundamentally regulated in a different way. They're much more complicated processes. And those are, CAR Ts are commercial products commercialized by pharmaceutical companies. Point of care in terms of like stem cell transplant is like almost like a service delivered by a hospital that's regulated in a different way, reimbursed in a different way. So it's much more a fundamental different pathway than just, hey, can a hospital make a CAR T? And I think that's sort of lost a little bit in the debate, that it's fundamentally different. I think the other thing I would just say that I think challenges point of care manufacturing is that right now it is sort of possible, right? With hospitals, can produce CAR Ts, they can test them, they can be efficacious. We've seen that, across the globe. But what that model was going to struggle with is how do you incorporate new innovations? Like this first generation of CAR Ts, we can work with that. CD19 is very ubiquitous. You can have a lot of different vectors that produce a CD19 CAR T that work, pretty close to the same. But my hope and anticipation and expectation is that over the next 5-10 years, we're going to have much, much more innovation there that isn't going to be able to be accessed ubiquitously in just making a CD19 CAR T. And that actually point of care will inhibit innovation getting getting to patients because it's going to be harder to evolve that kind of model, harder to get innovation implemented in that mode.
Yeah, I think you'd have to heavily move towards automation to use the point of care modality. I mean, you're not going to have manufacturing facility, traditional manufacturing facility in a hospital, right? That again, we don't have enough examples, but the way that I'm thinking about it is you're going to have more like a manufacturing equipment, something more automated, closed, where your nurse or whoever is going to just put your starting material in, and on the other side, you have something coming out, right? Like that's, otherwise you're going to turn these hospital workers into operators, right? And then that defeat the purpose. If you have if you're trying to do a 10 days process in the hospital, why not then use a decentralized kind of approach, right?
Mm-hmm. And who's going to, just to say, like, who's going to pay who owns those operators? Is it the hospital? Is it who owns that product? It's, the way CAR Ts have been developed, they are developed by commercial entities. So it's a Kite product, or it's a J&J product, or it's a BMS product. And so they are, through that process, accountable for the manufacturing. And I think that's sort of lost on the true point of care model of like, how is BMS going to assure that those nurses or whatever are making the right product? It just, I think the model just isn't there.
And there's an expectation of consistent quality, when you have a large company producing a drug, right? And so if we think about that, if we make the stem cell analogy or the stem cell transplant analogy, or I don't know, transplant surgery, whatever the case may be, right? You have some hospitals that are great at it, and some hospitals where you may not choose to go if you have a choice, right? And with this kind of approach, I think there will be an expectation, because of these have been approved drugs, right? There'll be an expectation that you get consistent delivery of quality and efficacy kind of across the board, and I think that is a challenge.
That's why I'm saying automation is I don't see a way around that.
Yeah, and on that point, which I think would be, I saw an audience question come in that was aligned with this question I planned to ask you guys, and I think would be a great way to close out this discussion. Something that I heard from Dr. Nirav Shah at this year's Bioprocessing Summit was that decentralized point of care manufacturing and centralized manufacturing shouldn't compete with each other, but rather they should complement each other. And so the question that I had is, not only how do we incentivize pharma to invest and try to popularize the decentralized model, but this question from Ethan is, for point of care manufacturing, how do we enable academic medical centers, which are already responsible for the majority of autologous batches in clinical trials, to become commercial manufacturing centers, especially for rare diseases where there isn't a large market for pharma to generate a return?
Yeah, I don't have a good answer to that. How do we motivate them? Yeah, I mean, it's money, right? Like,
yeah.
Well, and I think you could imagine sort of two ways this goes, right? I mean, what is an academic medical center less likely to have, right? They're less likely to have robust quality systems, qualified, fully qualified manufacturing facilities, equipment, trained teams, all of those pieces that are sort of part and parcel of executing cell therapy, in a commercial manufacturing facility. So either you have to raise the floor for those places, right? Or you have to lower the bar on the regulatory side to make that happen, which I think is probably the less likely scenario. And so, it's that raising the floor piece, and to Tal's point, are there automation approaches that can do it? You take human out of the loop, and that probably is the path forward, but I don't know.
I see a comment came in from Paul here. He said, academia cannot even spell GMP.
Well, that's so harsh.
Not all. I think that when we start with both decentralized and point of care, I mean, we're not imagining going from 0 to like 30 or 1,000 locations, right? You got to start somewhere. So I think starting slow, right? Having like maybe 4, let's talk about decentralized. Let's talk about these mobile manufacturing caravans or whatever, right? Let's have 4 and see how that goes. And then expand, gradually. I think we need to see how it works with 4 before we can imagine or find solution to how it's going to work with 100.
That's right. I think that's such a good point, Tala. Let's crawl before we walk before we run, and I think that's why the true point of care conversation, I think, almost distracts from what's realistic in how we're going to evolve this field. And it may evolve over the next 10, 15 years that we get to very automated systems that maybe it works in a hospital bed or each individual hospital. But I think there's a sweet spot in the intermediate term of not centralized manufacturing, everything goes to one plant and supplies the world, because this is a different kind of supply chain, and we lose out we add in all the complexities of shipping products long distances if we do that. We just discussed at length the true point of care model, but I think something like, if you want to call it decentralized, if you want to call it regionalized manufacturing, that Tal sort of points to, is sort of at a sweet spot where we're located, if you can see behind me, right next to the Texas Medical Center, which is more patients are treated in this area across everything than any place else in the world. So it sort of makes sense. Hey, put your cell therapy manufacturing where your starting material is, so you can get there by truck. I think those kind of solutions that harvest the low-hanging fruits are what we can evolve to. And as we go, exactly like Tal said, from 1 to 2 to 4 to 10, thinking about how we do that. Okay, these sites need to be interconnected. To Emily's point about consistent quality data, if they're all running paper-based systems and you're trying to demonstrate that these 5 sites are all making consistent product, that's going to be really hard to do. On the other hand, with the advancements in digital quality systems, all of these sites can be interconnected and literally running the same electronic batch record, literally getting all the data into the same database so that you can more easily produce a consistent product and demonstrate that. Yeah. And so I think the opportunity is, how do we take where we are today and make steps towards making these products more accessible? The other advantage, the advantage we have with autologous cell therapy is that for the most part, they are one and done, one infusion. And so even if we don't get it out to every rural hospital and things, you can imagine how it is more feasible for patients to travel some distance for a single dose treatment and then go home as they recover, and hopefully once they are cured. So I think all those things, we have to take into account the unique nature of autologous cell therapies. What are the challenges? What are the opportunities to come up with a fit for purpose solution in this manufacturing network discussion?
Yeah, I agree. And I just want to sharpen the point. It's like, do it because it makes sense, not because you can. So it needs to address something, right? And also to reiterate, we learn from experience. So maybe we have 5 of these facilities and we do have to demonstrate rigorous comparability across these facilities, but we get better at making them apples to apples over time, right? And we can do so by making sure that it's the same equipment, making sure that the training of operators is consistent, et cetera, et cetera. So we got to start somewhere, and we're going to work really hard for it. But over time, if it makes sense, if it addresses something, a real challenge, then I think then it can be expanded more easily, let's put it that way, from a regulatory perspective.
And to add to your point, Tal, and maybe loop us back to something we touched on at the very beginning of the conversation, there's, fit for purpose means different things and different indications, and different modalities. And so, Jason, you mentioned, this one and done paradigm. I think that is, obviously the ideal for cancer, right? There are, as we push out into other indication spaces, we may find it's actually a different modality that is the better fit in that space. There's a different treatment paradigm that evolves over time. So I think we have to remain open to the idea that what we've seen and sort of the pattern, if you will, that we're all sort of matching to right now may actually be the wrong pattern across the board, right in some areas, wrong in others. And we have to kind of remain open, to Tal's point, to do what makes sense. What's the most pragmatic, cost-effective, and an efficacious way that we deliver, disease-modifying, life-improving therapies to patients.
Great point. Great point.
Very great point. And I think that's a great point to end on. Unfortunately, we are out of time nearly, unless anyone has any concluding remarks for the audience, last points that they'd like to give. To everyone that asked an audience question. Oh, sorry, Jason. Were you going?
Sorry, Tyler. I was just going to, and I think, we talk a lot about challenges in this last hour. I just want to make sure that we don't lose sight of the massive opportunity in front of us. This new modality of cell therapies that has shown great efficacy has the chance to transform how we deliver healthcare and the kinds of outcomes we see. And so it's hard. There's a lot of challenges. We've touched on like a small part of them today, but from the bottom of my heart, I think it's worth all the blood, sweat, and tears that these panelists, the audience is working day and night to have this new modality reach its full potential. And it's going to be worth it. We're going to look back on this in 10, 15 years and be like, wow, how did we treat disease before we really figured out how to deliver cell therapies? It'll be transformative.
Yeah.
Very well said, Jason. I think we could all agree with that. And with that, folks, that wraps up today's Cell and Gene Live. I'd like to thank Emily, Jason, and Tal for being here. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and insights today. Thank you again to our sponsor, CPC, for sponsoring the Cell and Gene Live. And thank you, the audience, for coming and tuning in. Sorry we couldn't get to all your questions, but I will try to have the panelists answer them after the fact, and hopefully we can get some answers coming to you soon. So thank you, and have a good day.